On our campaign index page, we are now rendering out a list of campaigns, and we've got our button over here that the user can eventually click on to go and create a new campaign. Like I said previously, we haven't discussed navigation just yet. So we're going to come back to this button and make sure that someone can click on it to be taken to this other form where they will make a campaign. But again, that's something that we're going to come back to. Before we tackle that, I want to address one or two open issues in our campaign index component. First off, and this is a kind of easy one, I want to make sure that the top of the page has this nice open campaigns label. That's really easy to do. That's not going to be very challenging. But the other thing that we need to address that is a little bit harder is making sure that we can display a header on this page. One thing that you'll notice about the header up here is that it needs to not only appear on the campaign index page, but it also needs to appear on basically every other page that we have inside of our application. So we need to make sure that this header can show up everywhere. Now let's first take care of this little label right here, and we'll come back and talk about how we address that header. All right, so back inside my code editor, I'll say that just right above the render campaigns method call, I'm going to add in an h3 tag, and we'll give it the text open campaigns, like so. Now I'm sure this is going to work out just fine, but very quickly, we'll go and check it out inside the browser, and yeah, that looks just fine. Okay, so now we've got that easy part done. Let's start thinking about the header that we have to get to show up. Now, because this is some element that we want to show on every single page inside of our application, it definitely seems to me like we should not be attempting to recreate the header inside of every page component that we make. In other words, I don't really want to go into every page component that we eventually create and have to manually say like, okay, let's make a div and it's gonna have like the text Coinbase on the left-hand side and then like, campaigns on the right-hand side. So I obviously don't want to be doing that again and again and again. Instead, I think that we should definitely create one single header component and make sure that is used across all the different pages inside of our application. But you know what? I want to take that idea one step farther. So we know that we definitely have a header component on every page. And you know what? It's probably not completely unreasonable to assume that we might eventually want to have a footer as well. I'm saying maybe the footer looks identical here, but of course it would probably be a slightly different looking footer. So even thinking about kind of extracting or making a separate component for the header, I still don't want to have to come back into every one of these page components and place a header at the top and a footer at the bottom. I don't want to have to type this again and again and again. So it'd be really nice if we could figure out some way to have some common styling or some common elements across every page inside of our application. Now here's the good news and bad news. The good news is that we can definitely do that. We can figure out a way to have some common elements shown on every page. The bad news, there's always bad news. The bad news is that Next.js unfortunately does not make that the easiest thing in the world. It's just a little bit challenging to put that together. So let's talk about exactly how we're going to approach this. Now, as you very well know, because we've been discussing it nonstop, inside of our project, we have that pages directory. And every file inside that directory eventually ends up as being a separate visitable page for our users. And so we are saying that every one of these page components, we want to have a really easy way to get both a header and a footer injected in there. The problem is that it's not super easy with Next to get some common element or some common React component to wrap or kind of inject some common React component into each of these. So we're going to use a little workaround that at the end of the day is very easy and straightforward, but it's just something that kind of has to be explained so you understand what's going on. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to make a separate directory called components. Eventually, we're going to put a bunch of different React components into this thing that are used over all of our application. Inside this components directory, you and I are going to make one component called layout.js. The purpose of this layout is going to be to house some very common elements that we want to display on every separate page of our application. So for example, If we have a header, we'll display the header inside of here. And if we have a footer, we'll show the footer as well. We'll then import this layout component into every single one of our page components. And we will display that layout component inside there. Now that might not sound like it's going to save us a ton of time or something like that, right? It sounds like, hey, we still have to write this extra component in every one of our pages. But the idea here is that by having a single layout file, we can add all of our repeated components. So like the repeated headers and the footers and maybe a sidebar or whatever else. All these common elements can be added to this one layout.js file, and then we will eventually use that in every one of the pages. So if we ever want to get some repetitive element to show up on every single screen, rather than going back to every single page component, we can just go and add it to the layout. And that's it, just one spot and we're done. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Let's pause right here. We're going to come back to the next video. We're going to make this components directory. We're going to make the layout.js file, and then make sure that we use that inside of index.js. So quick pause, and we'll get started in the next video.